My name is John Heaps, President of the Council for Standards in Human Service Education. Recently, I had the privilege of having a conversation with Dr. Harold McPheeters, considered the founder of human service education in the United States. In the 1960s, mentally ill people were released from state hospitals into local communities. This action became known as deinstitutionalization. Although this effort was a humane program to help mentally ill people, there were two problems with it. First, there weren't enough programs in communities to receive the huge number of patients being released from state hospitals. And secondly, there were an insufficient number of workers to assist these people. Meanwhile, at the time of deinstitutionalization, there was a renaissance going on in higher education. A new movement to educate students who planned to stay in their communities was taking place. Dr. McPheeters and his colleagues on the Southern Educational Regional Board fused deinstitutionalization with the emergence of community colleges to develop the human service education movement in the United States. Noting the shortage of mental health workers in local communities, Dr. McPheeters and his colleagues approached community colleges to train students to become mental health workers. Within the cauldron of this effort, Dr. McPheeters and his colleagues not only developed education training programs for mental health workers, they also conceived of a new mental health worker role. No longer would a worker act solely with a patient like they did in a state hospital. Now they would also work with other human service professionals who provided services to patients in the community. For instance, when a patient needed housing, health care, a job, or other services, the new worker would act as a broker for these services, and sometimes they would act as an advocate on behalf of a patient or as a caregiver. The new community worker had broader responsibilities than their earlier counterparts in the state mental hospitals. They worked more with community-based human service programs, and they eventually became known as human service professionals. In this film, Dr. McPheeters recounts the early days of deinstitutionalization. He tells us what a human service worker does and what traits this person must possess to be an effective human service worker. He gives us a glimpse into who he is as a person, and Dr. McPheeters shows us how he became a human service professional. Now, our conversation with Dr. Harold McPheeters, the founder of Human Service Education. During deinstitutionalization in the 1960s, how was the new role, generalist mental health human service worker, conceived?
Traditionally, of course, the mentally ill and almost any kind of disabled person in America had been sent away to central institutions like mental hospitals and institutions for the mentally retarded and schools for the blind and schools for the deaf and schools for juvenile delinquents and whatever. And particularly with the Johnson administration, there was a feeling that ought to be deinstitutionalized, all those kinds of things, and the services ought to be provided to people in the local communities rather than in these large institutions that were halfway across the state from the families. It made it very difficult for them to ever get out and get back in the community. So there was a movement across the country to deinstitutionalize almost all kinds of programs. Now, there had been a national commission on mental health in the Eisenhower administration that had made recommendations about manpower. And of course, we were short of all kinds of professional manpower, psychiatrists, psychologists, psychiatric nurses, social workers, and so forth. And we had other projects here to try to start more programs and strengthen the programs in the South. But the recommendation that came out of that was that there needs to be the development, in addition to more training programs for those people, for new kinds of manpower. But was very non-specific of what that might be. Now, there was also a program started at that point called the New Careers Program at the federal level to develop new kinds of careers for people, particularly people like veterans coming out of the military services, so that they might have some kind of jobs. And our project came along right at that time, and we had some discussion at our Commission on Mental Health and Mental Retardation about whether we should give some leadership to that in the South, because of course we had more manpower shortages here than most sections of the country did, and particularly in the outlying areas. I mean, barely enough for in the big cities and all that. Like when I was Commissioner of Mental Health, other than the psychiatrists in the state mental hospitals, we had private psychiatrists only in Louisville, a couple in Lexington, and one in Covington. Paducah, Bowling Green, many of the places had no psychiatrists at all, and very few social workers or psychologists. So we decided to try to get a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to explore further whether it was possible to train some kind of a mental health worker. And the idea was not real clear at that point of what that would be. In particularly the community colleges, there was also a big push to develop community colleges all over the United States at that point. And in the South, many of the states, they had state-operated community colleges. They were not just local city colleges. And they were trying to develop them within 50 miles of every citizen in the state so they could commute to college and not have the expenses of living away and all that. And we had a project at the Southern Regional Education Board, not my project, but my program, that grew out of a research effort that Kellogg Foundation had funded to a community college in Florida to decide, was it feasible to train nurses, registered nurses, in associate degree programs in these community colleges. And it had been a success, and so then they had approached SREB about having somebody on board who could work to help community colleges all over the region develop some kind of, associate degree nurse programs. And so that lady met with our commission and talked about whether we could do something like that in the mental health area. So that first conference we had when we got a grant was to bring together a bunch of people, including people from community colleges, deans, and we had somebody there from the association, the National Association of Community and Junior Colleges, it was called then, and mental health professionals from around the region of all the various professions. They talk about, was it feasible to do something like this in the community colleges? And something about what would be the models. Well, at that point, it was the professionals tended to say, well, it ought to be an assistant psychologist who could do some of my testing. It would be an assistant casework, a social work case assistant. It would be a nurse assistant or something. But then after that, the notion was it was feasible, but somebody needed to refine this, what was it going to be actually, and what would the curriculum be? And so we went back and got another grant on the basis of that. The project director on that was Paul Penningroth, Dr. Paul Penningroth, the psychologist who was on the staff. Now, I joined the staff of SREB before this conference, but after the grant had been funded. I'd been on the commission in Kentucky, from Kentucky, when they decided to go for the grant, but I was not on the staff at that point. So then with the second grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, and this was then under their New Careers branch, we brought together, again, people from both community colleges, but primarily from mental health. And the feeling was, if you're going to have people deinstitutionalized out in the communities all over the rural South, the small South, city South, and the big city South, it was going to have to be someone who could handle at the basic level all of the needs of that person for housing, jobs, getting to medical care when he needs it and so forth. And sort of like the general practitioner, or now the family practitioner, who has the basic responsibility for sort of keeping you healthy and helping you with whatever you need as best he can or she can, and then knowing what the resources are to call on for a psychiatrist, a trained social worker, and so forth when it's needed. And that's where the idea of the generalist mental health worker came from, rather than an assistant to one or another of the specialists. Now, at the same time that project of ours was funded, the NIMH New Careers Branch had funded about a half a dozen community college programs that people had submitted grants on, sometimes from the nursing department, sometimes a psychologist or something. And so they had their little models they were proposing, a little psychologist, a little social worker, and so on. And so we involved them. I mean, some of them were from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Colorado, and they weren't all from the South by any means, although some were from the South. So we had the benefit of what they were looking at, and they had the benefit of what we were talking about. But this generalist idea very definitely evolved, and it was in the publication that became sort of the Bible for the movement at the time, the Roles and Functions for Mental Health Workers, that spelled out that concept and the roles that that kind of person would have to play in the community.
On that point, there are 13 roles that the generalist human service worker would play. Why those particular roles? Advocate, caregiver, broker. There were a whole host of things. Why were those particular 13 chosen as the critical ones?
Well, I think when you talked about, what kinds of things would this person do when he saw formerly mentally ill or mentally retarded kids or whatever coming in from the community, they were the kinds of things that in many cases a social worker would do, but they were at this sort of entry level, you're the first responder that you need to see, and often that's all you need. You don't need a whole lot of help, but you need some. And some of it's caregiving, some is sort of diagnosing, evaluating what is this person's situation, what are the resources that you can do. I guess the most controversial role of those was advocate, because most people were thinking of advocacy as something where you go down and give talks to the legislature and wave flags and maybe throw a bomb or two. But what we had in mind was just being able to help this person make a contact to get a job, a place to live, work in a sheltered workshop or something like that. And so often you run into the situation where they say, well, we can't take people till they're 12, or we can't take them after they're 15 or something. So what do you do with them between 15 and 18 when the other agency says we can take them? Well, frequently you can persuade that agency to make an exception for this person. And how do you do that? It's personal advocacy much more than system advocacy as such.
How did the term mental health worker become human service worker?
Now, one thing we found early on was that with our evaluation efforts was that these people were getting jobs doing what they were trained to do, but not necessarily in mental health agencies. In fact, mental hospitals were so rigidly structured with their psychiatric aides and so forth that relatively few of these people got jobs in the traditional mental hospitals. Now, they got them in aftercare programs, sheltered workshops, halfway houses, and so forth for the mentally ill. But they also got jobs working like in assisted living centers for older people, in special ed programs for any disabilities. Very frequently, the smaller schools had a classroom for all kinds of disabilities. So you had kids with vision problems and hearing problems and mental health problems and all in the same classroom. And there was a special ed teacher who was in charge, but she needed an assistant to say, take care of these kids while I work with these and so on. And they got jobs like that. Well, they did just fine. They could say it was consistent with their training. But they weren't mental health, as such. And so we found the terminology in their jobs switching to human service rather than just mental health. And of course, our grant came from a National Institute of Mental Health, so we tended to keep talking about mental health workers in our reports back to them. But actually, the thing was obviously clearly moving. And by the time we had ended the project, we'd been influential in establishing a national organization of human service workers and the Council for Standards in Human Services Education.
Would you describe the certification that you had in mind at that time?
Well, I don't think at the time we started this program we had certification in mind, but as the graduates began to come out, there was also an increasing movement in all of the health professions, particularly, to have workers certified. If you weren't certified or licensed or registered by some agency, Medicare and Medicaid would not pay for your care. And so if these people were going to get paid, they needed to have some kind of a certification or registration in order to qualify. And now most of the health insurance programs have picked up on that same idea. So it's more than Medicare and Medicaid. So that obviously became a necessary thing. But that was a later project. I guess we'd been working in this area for 5 years with the colleges and developing the curriculum guidelines and practicum training ideas and so forth. And then it was toward the end that this need for certification became more obvious. And so we had another project at the end, 2-year project, to develop a certification program and test it.
If you were hiring a human service worker today, what particular skills would you be looking for in that individual?
Well, like I said, it'd be the skills of those roles. And then a couple things that we talked about a lot that get to be a problem. And we found this in the evaluation on the certification project. Our certification test that we developed had knowledge and skill items, which are the traditional things we train in and test for and so forth when you're hiring somebody. But why do you fire people? You fire them for personality problems. You fire them for value problems. Now, when you think about it, all the skills you would want for a human service worker or a social worker are the same skills that you would want for a Nazi interrogating, one of the guys who works for the CIA and beats the people at Gitmo and so forth. You'd want the same identical skills, but a whole different set of values, a whole different set of personality skills. And those are things that academia didn't want to fool with. Job hirers don't want to fool with them either, but that's why they fire them. And one of the things the certification tests showed that the truly incompetent, the guys that flunked the test were truly incompetent by their supervisors. The ones that passed the test with the highest scores, though, were not necessarily the ones the supervisors rated the highest. And it was the personality and the value things that made the difference in the outstanding workers as opposed to the competent ones.
Could you describe some of those personal qualities that you would look for in a person?
Well, sort of a commitment to your, the kind of work you're doing, commitment to the client's need, not just your own need. I mean, it's 4 o'clock, gotta go home now. We can't see anybody after 3 o'clock because I gotta leave here at 4, and I know that kind of personal, I do only what I have to do attitude you don't need. And like I say, respect for other people and different values, different attitudes, and different people, and still ability to treat them humanely and so forth. Those are the things that I think are more important to, in addition to the basic skills that the certification tests.
If a human service student came to you and asked for a book or an author you would recommend, who would you suggest to them?
I don't know. I think one guy who probably touched on more kinds of mental illness in a more creative way than almost anybody else was Shakespeare. If you read his plays of Shakespeare, you learn an awful lot about the plays of emotions and mental illness and so forth.
Clearly, you recognize the benefits of deinstitutionalization. Can you give us some examples of success stories?
Like we have a whole lot of patients that have come through our rehab program at Community Friendship that work at the downtown, one of the big hotels. The woman in the Human Resources Department who helps us supervise all those people, some of them working from food service, some of them working maid service, some of them working maintenance. But she was one of our patients. She had a schizophrenic break when she was in college, and after we had her in our program, she took a job there at the hotel, and they were impressed with her, and she could relate to these other people that she'd seen coming from the mental hospital. So they hire her, and she's now sort of director of training for all of their personnel in the Human Resources Department for that hotel, one of the big hotels downtown, Hyatt Regency. And she's one of our ex-patients, but she helps supervise lots of others that are working in the program. Others work with the aftercare program at the hospital that works out in the more rural areas the hospital serves, other than the Atlanta area. But like I say, some of them have done very well in being aftercare workers of one kind or another. Some of them work in sheltered workshops and things like that.
As you look back on the whole deinstitutionalization movement, how would you evaluate it today?
Well, certainly in terms of the numbers of people who were able to go back to the community, it was a huge success. Like in Kentucky, when I first went to a mental hospital in Kentucky, they had 7,700 patients in the mental hospitals and schools for the retarded. Today, there's about 900, maybe less. And like when I went to New York as deputy commissioner, there was something like 19,000 people in the mental hospitals, and another, I don't know, it was altogether like 22,000 people we were responsible for in the mental retardation and mental health institutions. So in that sense, it's a great success. Now the big problem was the community mental health centers began to be developed, and then administrations changed and the funding was limited, and so many areas didn't develop the kinds of community mental health programs that were originally intended. And so I think it's left a lot of people, particularly in some of the rural areas, hanging out to, in more difficulty than they should have been. At the beginning of the Reagan administration, they had a group of people who evaluated all disabled people under what was then the Aid to Totally and Permanently Disabled program. It's now they call it Social Security something. Anyway, and they cut large numbers of people off the rolls. They said, this is not right. And particularly that happened to the mentally ill. They cut the mentally ill off because they were thinking in terms of people who lost an arm or blind, or like one fellow used to tell me, all the people that are in the rehab program are interested in is good, clean cripples. They don't want to deal with these people with mental illness and mental retardation. But at any rate, they cut large numbers of people off who ended up in poverty situations.
How do you sustain a life of service to other people? How do you keep it going?
I don't know, it's one of those things, from when you were a kid, you sort of learn that if you've had opportunities, you have a certain obligation to give back and make the world a better place for other people too.
As you reflect upon your career in the human services, what legacy do you see yourself leaving to the field?
I don't know, some of these things in, new trends in education for mental health and human services. I think also we were among the leaders in the deinstitutionalization movement in Kentucky. When I first became commissioner, we had 7,400 people in this mental hospital. Now, Thorazine had just been invented. We had 7,700 when I first set foot in the mental hospital. It's going down to 7,400 when I became commissioner. And I remember going to Happy Chandler, the governor. I was a cabinet officer in his cabinet, and saying, I want to set a slogan of 6,000 by 60. And he said, you have it, and I'll talk about that. So he went around the state talking about it. We're going to reduce it to 6,000 patients by 1960. And we made it into the 6,000s anyway during his administration by working on developing community placements and having social workers out in the community that could do the sort of caseworker kind of thing we're talking about. There were, like I say, communities that had no trained social workers either, but we put them out there to follow up on the mentally ill that were being placed in their communities and help them with their placement and so forth. We started halfway houses and rehab. We started one of the first rehab centers for the long-term mentally ill in Louisville. And then I worked on starting one here. I was on the original board, Community Friendship, and I'm still on the board. They've been on there 30-some odd years. But it's concerned with helping the people that are coming out of the state mental hospitals to adjust in the community, learn to ride the bus system and balance their budgets and live within their means and get along with people and participate in the community. Many years ago, we got a grant from NIMH at SREB and sent a group of psychiatrists who were state mental health directors like myself, that's when I was in Kentucky, and some state legislators to visit European mental health facilities where they were doing things differently. This is when the deinstitutionalization movement was starting. And we visited like sheltered workshops in Netherlands. We visited a program in Belgium where they have a whole bunch of people living out in the community and other family homes and very little institutional, group. We visited sheltered workshops in England and France, new mental hospital and all that they had in France with different technologies and all, to come back and hopefully implement some of those ideas. Deinstitutionalization was of the institution itself, like open hospitals, instead of having gates and bars and everything locked up. Patients ought to be able to come and go and they ought not bother people in the community. You need to rehabilitate them on that. But like we had a barred fence around Western State Hospital in Hopkinsville. After we took that fence down, the folks gave me one of the little fleur-de-lis peaks on a mounted thing, the symbol of that fence being gone. But we took them down around all of our hospitals and started rehab programs with the state rehab program. And like I say, the place we started in Louisville is a separate rehab center. There's now 2 of them there to help those people get back in the community.